to a deep dive into two of the biggest forces shaping, well, our entire contemporary existence: consumer culture and postmodernism. Our listeners shared a truly fascinating stack of sources that takes these concepts, which, everyone uses, and it really unpacks them.
And our mission today is to move past the superficial buzzwords, the easy definitions, right? We are investigating not just what these phenomena are, but how they arose, what their political function is, and what they reveal about global inequality and the changing texture of our daily lives.
It's a huge dive into what defines the modern condition, really, the cultural landscape we all operate in.
It is,
But we're going to start by looking at the academic landscape itself. It seems the intellectual stock market has been a bit turbulent. Some concepts are soaring, while others have, well, dropped out of sight.
they certainly have. If you trace the history, you have these early critical theorists. Think of figures like Adorno and Horkheimer.
Right? The Frankfurt School.
Exactly. They offer these incredibly heavy, dense critiques of mass culture. But today, their approach is it's often dismissed as being elitist.
I saw the sources mention that they were criticized for making these supposedly dubious distinctions between, say, real and pseudo-individuality or true and false needs. A bit moralizing, maybe?
Exactly. They were accused of moralizing from a position of, privilege, looking down on popular culture and having very little sympathy for the integrity of the popular class's pleasures.
So they just missed the genuine creativity in it.
They missed the creative appropriation of commercial goods. Yeah,
And if you track that intellectual shift over roughly 15 years leading up to the mid-2000s, the sources are crystal clear. The intellectual stock of consumer culture has absolutely risen.
well, it's tangible, right? It's measurable. It's relevant to everything we do.
About postmodernism.
Postmodernism has become much harder to pin down, and so consequently, it's dropped out of sight. It's often considered démodé fashionable.
It just got too abstract, way too abstract. But so if the concept of postmodernism itself is fading, it raises a key question. When we talk about it, are we describing a real change in the world? Or are we just describing how cultural experts are talking about the world?
That is the core question. It's so important to ask not just what the postmodern is, but why and how we are concerned with this particular question.
So it's about the people asking the question.
It is. It highlights the active role that cultural specialists, academics, critics, designers play in educating and forming audiences to see their lives through that specific label. They're providing the lens.
They're actively framing the shift itself, maybe even demonopolizing knowledge by giving us new ways to interpret things, or maybe just setting up new hierarchies.
Both. And this leaves the sources to suggest that we should really move past those simple, rigid historical boxes: tradition, modern, and postmodern.
Because life isn't that neat.
Not at all. If you actually examine daily life, there's so many similarities, so many continuities between these eras.
Which is why the source suggests we should view these overlapping experiences as what they call transmodern.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that these ideas aren't separated by neat historical breaks. They're ongoing, flowing concepts. The struggles continue. They just change their names.
Okay, let's unpack this core vision of consumer society. The source is painted as this powerful paradox, both a dream of limitless abundance and at the very same time a nightmare of accumulating risk.
The dream of abundance is just foundational to modern life. It's driven by science and technology, promising this endless supply of new goods, labor-saving devices,
And the cultivation of personality right through grooming, self-presentation.
all of it. This promise of material ease was the reward offered for participating in industrial expansion.
But the sources make it explicitly clear that this abundance is not free. It comes with some profound limits and a really dangerous dark side.
Absolutely. The consumer society is simultaneously a risk society. We're accumulating not just goods, but new bads.
New bads. So we're talking about things like global warming.
Global warming, but also more immediate things like genetically modified food, new viruses, antibiotic-resistant superbugs.
What's so fascinating here is how politically difficult this culture is to constrain, even when those risks are, staring us in the face. Why do politicians always seem to choose growth over ecological safety?
It's largely political necessity. Consumer culture is just essential to the modern nation-state. It's a major source of production, employment, and crucially, it's a key mode of legitimation.
Legitimation, you mean prosperity, visible consumption, is a sign that the government is succeeding.
Precisely. It's a sign of a nation-state success, and its standing in the world. So if you threaten that flow of goods,
You threaten the government's very legitimacy.
that is the bind. The sources note that politicians are extremely reluctant to sign up to ecological policies if they jeopardize economic growth. They'll usually opt instead for the technological fix.
The idea that some new invention will save us.
Right betting on nanotechnology or hydrogen engines or nuclear fusion to allow the economy to just proceed at full speed while hoping to clean up the mess later.
And the sources give a really high-profile example of this tension from the mid-2000s.
Yes, the huge public debate around Al Gore's movie An Inconvenient Truth. The U.S. Fox News Channel headlined its coverage with the question, "Could it destroy our economy?" And commentators just immediately dismissed the need for action as hysteria and socialist regulation. It perfectly illustrates how any constraint on consumption is immediately framed politically as an existential economic threat.
And globally, this problem is just accelerating the expansion of consumer culture and new Asian economies. China and India, for example, might be staving off a global recession.
But it's dramatically increasing global environmental problems. More air travel, more waste, more emissions across the board.
And that takes us directly to the staggering global inequality tied to this whole process.
It does. The sources state that the richest 1% of the world's population owns 40% of the planet's wealth.
40%.
Meanwhile, over 800 million people go to bed hungry every night. This isn't just about economic models. Consumption is emphatically not an innocent act. It's tied to these vast global chains of dependency and stark inequality.
And yet this tension is what gives rise to the consumer citizen.
A crucial development. This citizen is not just a shopper. They have rights, but also the responsibility to ask questions about the consequences, risks, and planetary costs of consumption.
And we see this right in demands for carbon cost labeling on goods.
Exactly. Or in the greater public awareness of sweatshops in the global information that's being driven by the internet.
And if we talk about the economic engine for all this globally, the US and British model of consumption is just relentlessly sold to everyone. The debt model.
It's the engine of contemporary growth. Financial institutions just bombard consumers with easily accessible credit. And critically, debt has lost the pejorative overtones it once carried.
It's not shameful anymore.
Not at all. We learned that as far back as the 1950s, a bestseller was already reminding readers that thrift is now an American.
Wow, thrift is UN American. That is a complete inversion of values rooted in, prudence or religion. So the entire culture encourages what the sources call a calculating hedonism.
Right? It's a cost-benefit analysis of pleasure. You calculate how much debt you can sustain to fund the lifestyle you want.
But it's so important to note that this isn't some universal human law.
No, not at all. Thrift and saving have historically been central to modern Japanese consumer culture. That's made it very difficult to stimulate their economy with cheap credit. And this reluctance to embrace debt is also evident in, France, Germany, and Italy.
So the high debt model is not universally embraced.
Fell from it.
This pressure for calculating hedonism, it doesn't just affect our wallets. It changes how we style our entire existence. And here's where it gets really interesting. How does all this economic pressure translate into our personal lives and experiences?
It shifts us fully into the realm of cultural sensibilities, what they call the aestheticization of everyday life. This is a hallmark of postmodern sensibilities. It involves the effacement of the boundary between art and everyday life. the collapse of those old high culture versus low culture distinctions.
So art stops being just something you see in a museum and starts becoming everything. Your clothes, your car, the coffee shop you go to.
Exactly. The sources identify three key dimensions, driving this first through the artistic avant-garde.
Like Dada and Surrealism.
Yes, those historical movements sought to break the barrier between art and life. Postmodern art built on that, with artists like Warhol treating debase, consumer commodities, soup cans, Brillo boxes as legitimate art. Art basically legitimizes the commodity.
And the second dimension deals with the media onslaught we all experience constantly, what they call the hyperreal.
That's the hyperreal, or image saturation. The sheer density and speed of images in contemporary society pushes us toward this simulation of world where the distinction between reality and image is effaced.
What the sources term the aesthetic hallucination of reality. Does that mean our social critique becomes less powerful? Like, are we just numb to risk if we're constantly dealing with an aestheticized version of it?
Well, the argument is that the continuous diverse flow of images, it's like on MTV back in its heyday, or, on social media now, it creates such an intensity of signifiers that it defies any easy attempt to systematize it or to critique it.
It's just always on, always flowing.
Always aestheticized. And the third dimension deals specifically with how we buy things,
Commodity aesthetics.
right? This is the calculated use of design and imagery to give commodities an aestheticized image to create these elaborate dream worlds. And this isn't new. We can trace it all the way back to the 1850s to the Bon Marché department store in Paris.
What were they doing back then?
The sources note they were arranging pots and pans into a spectacular South Sea Island display with shells, coral, beads, palms.
Wait, so they were selling cookware by surrounding it with fake seashells and coral? That sounds incredibly tacky.
It sounds tacky, but it was effective. It's like a 19th century Instagram filter trying to sell you a fantasy life.
They're not just selling a pan.
They're selling a narrative, a lifestyle. And who designs all these fantasy life?
The new cultural intermediaries.
Yes, this expanding group of professionals, media, advertising, design, fashion journalists, these para-intellectual fields. They are the new tastemakers,
And they ransack traditions and global cultures to create new symbolic goods.
and importantly, they provide the interpretations on how to use them. They promote that self-conscious lifestyle cultivation, that learning mode towards consumption, where your body, your home, your car, they're all styled as extensions of your individual persona.
They're essentially transmitting this artistic aesthetic lifestyle to a mass audience.
And this movement towards stylistic excess and play, it resonates with pre-industrial traditions. The sources link postmodern culture to older traditions of transgression, protest, the carnivalesque.
Ah, the carnival where everything was symbolically inverted. The grotesque body, excess, food drinking, promiscuity. A space of order disorder.
Correct. And while the civilizing process pushed us toward more emotional control in rigid manners, the Victorian era, for example, that distance created a fascination, a nostalgia for the expelled other, the slum, the fair, the seaside resort.
So we became fascinated with what we'd suppressed.
Exactly. And the source highlights that even the massive informalization process, like the 1960s counterculture, was often misread as a breakdown of control.
It wasn't a breakdown. I mean, it looked like chaos.
It was chaos, but it was carefully managed chaos. It actually depended upon greater self-control and a very subtle shift toward a decontrolled control of the emotions.
Decontrolled control? That sounds like a contradiction.
It does, but think about it. You needed a higher degree of interregulation to manage the relaxation of social codes, to engage in genuine emotional exploration, or manage fluid aesthetic experiences without, losing control entirely.
So we're talking about the difference between repressed Victorian manners and the kind of calculated vulnerability you need for modern social life.
Exactly that. You are highly controlled internally, so you can navigate externally fluid and open social environments. You need emotional intelligence, a refined form of self-management.
No, we absolutely have to shift the lens away from a purely Western narrative.
We do because our sources highlight the concepts like modernity and consumer culture have deep alternative roots outside of Europe.
This is a really crucial critique of Eurocentrism. Traditionally, sociology often used a stark dichotomous model, tradition versus modern, which often depicted China and Asia as static.
As only capable of change through Western influence. That traditional view is now being heavily challenged. We find compelling evidence of what you could call proto-modernity in Asia centuries before the West's supposed cultural takeoff.
So, where do we see this consumer culture emerging so early?
Look at Ming Dynasty China between 1368 and 1644. This saw a widespread commodification and a really sophisticated urban consumer culture. There were books detailing the principles of appreciating and collecting art and fashionable luxury goods,
It's like a how to guide for being rich.
basically. Yeah. The treatise on superfluous things and conspicuous consumption by the nouveau riches was definitely a thing. They had to learn how to manage their wealth publicly.
And Japan provides an equally strong case.
Oh yes, Tokugawa Japan from 1603 to 1867. Edo, which is now Tokyo, became the world's largest city in the 18th century. It had a strong print industry, novels, handbooks, magazines for a highly literate public.
So, what did that look like?
The period exhibited so many sensibilities we associate with modernity: a dynamic fashion system, a high velocity of consumer goods, and an intense concern for the stylized presentation of self.
But the social structures were still very hierarchical. How did that square with the emergence of what we think of as modern civic life?
It created what the source is called civility without civil society. Instead of the big political public sphere that emerged in Europe, Tokugawa Japan developed unclaved public spheres.
Okay, so non political voluntary associations.
Exactly. They were called ZA arts for things like poetry, tea ceremony, painting. Relatively free discursive spaces dedicated to aesthetic sociability.
And cultural diversity and identity play.
Right. Within these spaces, people developed a capacity for identity switching and fluid situational self-management. They could detach from their fixed social roles and assume temporary chosen identities.
Which the source suggests is an important index of modernity.
It's seen as modernity before modernization.
So, why does this historical critique matter so much today? Does finding evidence of this merchant culture and aesthetic life in Ming China fundamentally change how we think about the spread of capitalism?
It changes everything. It challenges the whole notion that the unique cultural complex of the West was the exclusive generator of these phenomena.
So, consumer culture isn't just a Western export.
It suggests a long-term process of cultural accumulation that occurred globally. It means concepts like consumer culture aren't simply imports into Asia, but have deep alternative histories there. It just broadens our historical frame dramatically.
What stands out to me from this review is how interconnected and really continuous these cultural phenomena are. Spanning from 17th century Japan to today's debates over global emissions, we've seen that the cultural landscape isn't defined by neat breaks, not modern versus postmodern, but by ongoing struggles, the demonopolization of knowledge by these new cultural intermediaries, and a pervasive, irresistible aesthetic impulse in daily life.
The challenge we face remains profound. Though consumer culture is now too firmly established, it promises the dream of abundance, but operates entirely through the calculus of the commodity form and environmental risk.
And the ultimate dilemma is that the generalization of the US-style consumption model is ecologically impossible.
It would require 3.5 planets if everyone consumed like Americans. This planetary crisis is absolutely real, Yet very few are willing to rein in their own consumption, either on a personal or a national level.
It's the ultimate terrifying modern dilemma.
It is. So here's a provocative closing thought for you to consider building directly on that 3.5 planet statistic.
Okay.
Rather than continuing to obsess over realizing the dreams of material abundance, which was so central to 20th century American society as it chased the end of scarcity, the sources suggest we might consider the cultivation of psychic abundance.
Psychic abundance.
Means seeking to abolish the current time famine and striving to create genuine leisure by abandoning our obsession with productivity. And by doing that, potentially finding alternatives to our current high material consumption and constant travel way of life.